With two simple changes, Reavers become absolute gods at clearing, and this is particularly true on closed maps. You can see me absolutely eviscerating these closed maps with some of the fastest minion clear speeds you've probably ever seen in these tier 18 maps. And the way that this is working is in part because of Relentless Fallen, which is going to give them 20% increased movement speed, which is going to significantly reduce their downtime, making them clear that much quicker. And the other thing that we're doing is we're using the weapon swap tech to occasionally restack our minions. See, as long as minions are already stacked, they can stay stacked. And as you can see in these clips, you can see they just, a ball of my Reavers are just running through this dungeon, all of them attacking every single enemy that spawns. And if they ever become unstacked from that ball, I just desummon and resummon them real quick, and we're back online. You can see this clear speed is absolutely ridiculous. And to really drive that point home, I went out of my way to hunt down closed maps with doorways and everything that Reavers are supposed to suck against. And you will see in the unedited footage I'm going to show you later just how good they are on these maps. Before I show you that, let's first look at their boss damage, which is just absolutely insane. You can see in this first clip, this boss has over 12 million hit points, yet he dies in less than 20 seconds. With everything up and running, this build is doing over 1 million DPS. And in the second clip, you can see a normal, tier 17 or whatever boss that dies in like 5 or 6 seconds or something insane. The damage of this build in both single target and in AoE is absolutely ridiculous. And a lot of that damage is actually coming from a change that I've made to the build where I'm now playing with Immolate, which is going to give them 30% of the damage as fire. And I'm also playing with Fire Infusion, which is going to give them an extra 25% of their damage as fire. This is then combined with Flammability, which is going to be reducing enemies' fire resistances, so that fire damage is going to be getting scaled. And then on the Hellhound, we're playing with Fire Exposure. So what this means is that we're actually able to scale this damage ridiculously hard, giving enemies like negative 65 fire resistance, and then that is scaled up with this damage, which is pretty damn incredible. We're also playing Armor Break on the Infernal Hound now, and actually, I'm kind of surprised at how fast this stacks. But we are playing with Splinter here, where 15% of the physical damage that the Hound deals breaks armor, and then pairing that with Armor Break to break it even faster. And you can see against these bosses and stuff, they're permanently broken. The Hound actually hits ridiculously hard, which I didn't know this until I tried this out, and I did some testing where I desummoned all my minions, just played the Hound. This dude hits hard. And then when you also give him Culling Strike, he's also got this Execute. And so the Hound ends up carrying, Armor Break, Fire Exposure, Execute in the form of Culling Strike, and he ends up adding so much damage to this build. And with the Reavers, with the stacking the fire damage and the negative fire resistance, you can see why this build is now doing a lot more damage. Now, on top of those changes, we've also learned some new stuff about the passive tree. For starters, bolstering presence actually does not work with Pain Offering. Despite the fact that this says it increases the effects of auras, it does not work. So we have dropped that from the build, and we have gained some extra points. And you can see that I've actually done quite a bit of respecking here, and I went completely out of these notes here, out of Collaboration and out of Crystalline Flesh, and now I'm instead grabbing Living Death for my resistances. So I used to come all the way up here for Crystalline Flesh, and I would grab Collaboration, but instead I'm getting my minion resistances from here, and then I'm able to pick up Patient Barrier for an extra 60% energy shield. And what you're going to notice as we go through this is that not only with this new passive tree are my minions faster, they're also tankier, and I'm also able to get the same amount of energy shield despite the rework. So this means that we are now significantly tankier, and the minions are tankier, and they're faster with this new passive tree, which is pretty incredible. Now, one other thing that's really important to talk about with this passive tree is the fact that our jewels need to have minion elemental resistance. This is something that I noticed a lot of people seem to be missing in the previous videos. I got a lot of questions about how we're capping minion resistances, and this is how. You need to get minion elemental resistance on your jewels. And once you do that, you're going to be easily res capping your minions. And what's so great about the Reavers is that they're going to be sitting at like 14,000 health. So let me teleport over here and show you real quick. But yeah, you can see that the Reavers are actually sitting at 16,000 hit points, which is absolutely insane. They also have 3,000 armor, tons of physical damage reduction. Their resistance capped with 63 chaos res, These boys are freaking tanky, and as I talked about in my previous video, they're also able to play without Feeding Frenzy, meaning they don't have that extra 20% incoming damage that most other minions have. This makes them absurdly tanky. So not only are they doing ridiculous damage, they're also ridiculously tanky. Pretty good combination if you ask me. In case you're unaware, there's also been a giant shift in the metagame of stat prioritization across all builds. This is because we realized that increased rarity of items found is actually a ridiculously powerful stat, and it's very important to get it in this build and in all builds. And later in the video, I'm going to talk about how you can actually get it really easily when we talk about the gear. But before we do that, I want to fully go through the support gems and skills and go a little bit deeper into the passive tree and really break down the core changes that have happened that made this build so much better. So as we were talking about with the Infernal Hound, we're going to be running Splinter with Demolisher to break armor using his auto attacks. Then he's going to be running Fire Exposure to apply fire exposure to enemies through his Ignite. Then he's going to have Strip Away for 30% increased effect, and then Coaling Strike for that Execute. This Execute is really powerful, and it's important to keep in mind, by the way, these support gems are ordered in the priority that you should have them. So if you only have 3 support gems, run these first 3, and then, add for your 4th and 5th when you get them. Now, next up is Flammability. So we're going to be running Hex Bloom, which allows it to spread when a cursed enemy dies. Heightened Curse, which is going to increase the effect by 25%. And then Focus Curse, which allows the effect to go off faster. Now, Pain Offering, as usual, is a really important piece of the build. We're going to be running it with Font of Rage for increased rage generation. This will allow our Reapers to get Rage even without using their active ability. We have Persistence, which increases the duration. Dance Macabre, which is going to increase the effect by 30% at the cost of eating 2 minions instead of 1. And then Ablation, which is going to give it another 30% effect, but it's going to cost 15% of our life on use. Now with Ablation, you can take this off for certain maps, and if you really don't like to use your life, you can take this off, but the effect is just so strong, I think it's very worth it. Now, the clerics are really interesting. So for starters, we're running Ingenuity, which is going to give them a 30% increased recovery rate, which gives them more revives, because revive uses a cooldown. Then we're going to be giving them +1 levels of minion skills. So this is going to give them more maximum life, and it's also going to increase the effect of their heal. And you can see that on cast is going to be giving 2,200 life regen. So Minion Mastery is actually pretty good. And then we're going to be giving them Meat Shield, which is going to reduce their damage, but it's going to give them more life. And you can see my guys are sitting at 20k life, which is quite a bit, and they also have all the same resistances and everything else. So these clerics are actually pretty tanky, very good backliners. Now for the Reavers, these guys, we just want to get as much damage as possible. So Martial Tempo is a really important piece because it's going to allow them to stack their rage faster whenever you activate them. They have Heft, which Heft is currently giving an increase of 60% maximum physical damage, which is really strong. Heavy Swing, again, just more damage. And then we have the Immolate, which is going to give them 30% of their damage. 30% of their damage is fire against ignited enemies, because the Hellhound's always igniting everything. This is really strong. Then we're also giving them Fire Infusion, as we discussed earlier. And remember, because these are our lowest 2 priorities, if you don't have these yet, there's not really much point in running Flammability. But yeah, you want to add the Fire combo as the last piece of the build. Now I'm also playing Blink, and it's important with your Blink that it's not relegated onto your core set, because this thing costs like, 60 spirits. So you're going to be losing almost 3 minions to run Blink. So put it on your second weapon set, not your first weapon set, and then whenever you swap, you have access to Blink. Now, another piece that we've added to the build that I think is going to become increasingly meta in all builds is the inclusion of a Shock Storm Mage. Basically, you just slap on Stormfire, which is going to make it so his shocks never expire. You give him Conduction, so he has double the chance to shock. And then you give him Overcharge. So this is going to increase the effect of the shock by 75%. So this makes his shock into like a 32.5% damage increase. And then when you combine that with the, Stormfire, it's never going to expire. So the reduced duration, that doesn't have much of an effect. This is part of what allows you to kill bosses so quickly. And then you're also playing Coursing Current, so that when it does proc a shock, it's going to shock enemies in an AoE. Now, this one is really low priority, by the way. Don't waste resources getting access to Coursing Current. I just already had it because I already had a 4-slot, like a 4 support gem Skeletal Storm Mage, because I was testing them. But it's not worth it to invest to get this. This is like super low priority. Now, Detonate Dead is very worth it to get all 3 of these. So Detonate Dead, again, just super broken, does percent mob health and an AoE. It's just absolutely phenomenal. With the breach meta coming into play, where like breaches are the best thing to farm, having an uncapped, ginormous AoE that does percent mob maximum health is just ridiculously good. We're running Magnified Effect for increased area of effect, Spell Echo so that it, casts twice every time we cast it, and then Considered Casting, which is going to give it a 40% damage multiplier. Finally, we're running Grim Feast as usual because of the amazing energy shield. This still hasn't been nerfed, but we will be keeping an eye out because, Grim Feast is actually like ridiculously strong. So I doubt it's going to last forever. But as long as it's lasting, we're going to abuse the hell out of it by stacking the ever-living crap out of energy shield multipliers. So let's talk about this new passive tree, and let's talk about some of the optimizations that I've made and some of the changes that allow you to get a lot more for the same amount of points. So, for starters, one thing that is actually very important that becomes very important as you start to incorporate the weapon swap tech more is increased revive time for your minions, which is a big reason why we are speccing down here to get Living Death. Because, as I'm sure a lot of you guys that have tried the weapon tech know, occasionally you're going to mess it up and you're going to desummon your minions while some of your minions are already dead, and then you won't have any minions for like 7 or 8 seconds. Just grabbing like this point into Living Dead is going to make them revive 15% faster, which is going to shave about 2 seconds off whenever you make that mistake. Because that mistake actually happens fairly frequently, I think it's worth it to grab Living Death. Probably if you play the build perfectly, you don't take this, but I think it's very worth it to pick up in the meantime. And because attributes are so tight for this build, so attributes are ridiculously tight because we need a lot of strength to be able to run a lot of the bases that we want to play, but we also need a ton of intelligence to run our gems. So one of the nodes I really like that I've started playing is Pure Energy, which is going to give us 30% increased maximum energy shield and 10 points to our intelligence. And this ends up working out really well because we're able to get increased survivability and increased revive time for our minions, and then we can grab Pure Energy Shield. Very, very powerful. We're also, as I mentioned earlier, instead of spending a bunch of points to come all the way over here to Crystalline Flesh to get minion resistance, we're instead grabbing it up here, which costs less points. Even though the maximum resistance is lower, it costs us less points to get here, so it's worth it. And it's giving us access to Patient Barrier, and theoretically Ingenuity as well. If you're having attribute problems, you can just grab Ingenuity for 25 intelligence, and all of your attribute problems immediately go away. We're still running the full crit package with like Grip of Evil, Necrotic Touch, coming down here, Deadly Swarm. We're still running this full crit package, but Entropic Incarnation is now fully online with this build because we are no longer running Brutality and are instead running like that fire damage kit, which means we are now getting this full chaos damage. That is pretty sweet. And then we're getting a lot more minion survivability from grabbing Left Hand of Darkness as well. And as I mentioned earlier, it's very important in your jewels to make sure that you're getting elemental resistance for your minions. You can see that I'm capped out at 78%, but to do that, you need to have minion elemental resistance on these jewels. Finally, we're still running the same kind of pseudo armor stacking combo where we're grabbing some of these armor nodes to increase the amount of armor that we have, and then we are imprinting heat proofing onto our necklace so that our armor applies to fire damage. And of course, with Altered Flesh, we're converting cold and lightning into fire, so then our armor is getting applied to the cold and lightning damage, so we're getting tons and tons of mitigation. We're also running Be It Its Hand, which is converting life into energy shield, and Be It Its Will, which is converting life into spirit. So the result is, we can't run Chaos Inoculation because we need maximum life, but what we can do is we can abuse Be It Its Hand by stacking a ton of maximum life along with a ton of energy shield percent multipliers, and then we can abuse Altered Flesh by getting heat proofing so that our armor applies to fire damage, so our armor is now applied to all elemental damage essentially, getting tons of extra fire resistance cap so that we're mitigating that damage even more, and then we're able to just have an insane amount of energy shield thanks to a combination of, Beat Its Will in combination with all of these percent energy shield nodes, and that is where so much of our survivability is coming from. Now, let's talk about item rarity, and I also want to talk about another adjustment I made to my gear with regards to resistances. So on your rings, There's actually not a lot of super powerful prefixes that you can get. Maximum life is amazing, but after that, like maximum mana is okay, and there's not really very much good stuff you can get. This means on your rings, getting the prefix stat of rarity of items is very affordable for minion builds because we lose so little to get it. So that's where I would start when you start stacking your item rarity, which you should begin to do pretty early, but especially as you start getting into like tier 15 plus maps, you definitely want to start getting item rarity. And the first place you should look to get it is on your prefix rolls on your rings. Now, item rarity is kind of weird because it can roll as a prefix and a suffix. So you can see on this ring, on this one ring, I have 44% increased item rarity, which is really strong. And so you want to get a ton of item rarity, and you're going to notice a very big difference in the amount of gear that you get. But another adjustment that I've made is I've started stacking more elemental resistance than I used to. So because there's so many sources of negative elemental resistance, it's actually pretty important that you overcap it. Now, the most common source of elemental reduction is going to be elemental weakness, which is going to reduce your elemental resistance by 15%. So my advice to you is to generally just try to get your resistances overcapped by 15%. So like my fire resistance I need is 80, but I'm instead going all the way to 98. So 98 minus 15, 83. So even if I have elemental weakness, I'm still going to be fire res capped. This adjustment makes the build a lot better when clearing that ridiculously hard content that I love to farm. But overall, I hope you guys can see how this build is able to do so much more damage, how it's so good for mapping, and just so good at so many things. I think that Reavers are like super underrated by a lot of other creators and a lot of people, and I feel like it's partly because they just haven't gotten used to the resummon stuff. Once you get down the resummon stuff, this build is absolutely ridiculous, and I would argue it's probably the strongest overall minion build currently. You just have to spend like an hour learning the weapon swap tech, and the build is absolutely ridiculous. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Good luck playing the build. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.